T. There has been a murder in one of the largest cities in Spain. Several people saw the murderer. Although the reaction was immediate, the killer vanished into thin air. Did he commit the perfect crime? Or maybe he was lucky? Will he escape responsibility for his actions and never be brought to justice? How come there are so many question marks on this case? My name is Peter and I invite you to the next episode. An episode that will show that sometimes an inconspicuous drunk can turn out to be the master of life and death. Madrid, this is where the mysterious crime took place, which has been keeping the investigators awake for 50 years. According to Spanish law, in 6 years the perpetrator will be able to sleep peacefully. The crime of homicide will expire, and then the person responsible can confess to the whole world and bear no responsibility. Unfortunately, the much-announced changes in the penal code have still not entered into force, and the statute of limitations for murder after 30 years is still in force. It is Friday, the 6th of September 1974. Despite the time of year, that day the weather was exceptionally spring-like. Temperatures showed 26 degrees Celsius at noon, and people took advantage of the last rays and warm sun. A carefree Friday day was interrupted by information about an injured man lying on the pavement on one of the streets in Madrid. According to the report, the victim was a young man with a wound to the stomach. He was still alive, so the emergency response time was invaluable. After only a few minutes, the ambulance stopped next to the gathered onlookers, and paramedics rushed to the rescue. The wound looked deep. The victim lost a lot of blood and it was unreasonable to delay transport to the hospital. The wounded man was immediately on the stretcher. Rescuers slid them into the patient compartment, and after a short while the characteristic sound of priority signals was moving away from where the police were now approaching. At the moment, no one knew what really happened. The injured man was most likely attacked, but the circumstances were still unclear. That changed when investigators from the Criminal Investigation Department took action. The key action was to identify the witnesses of the event before they disperse in different directions and never again testify to the record of the interrogation. At the same time, an ambulance arrived at the hospital. The patient's condition was described as serious during transport. Therefore, as soon as the ambulance stopped at the hospital's driveway, a group of medics took over the injured man, and after a while the staff of people found themselves in the operating room. There was a desperate fight for the life of a young boy. Unfortunately, the stab wound was too deep. The tool caused internal bleeding and there was nothing the doctors could do. The patient died after 2 hours. From now on, the sidewalk became a crime scene. Forensic technicians secured traces, which were not too many. First of all, there was no murder weapon. The murderer also left no traces, or at least the police did not find any. The same incident also happened elsewhere. As suggested by the traces of blood on the concrete pavement, the victim walked several dozen meters before losing consciousness. Investigators began routine questioning of witnesses. One of the women testified that she watched a man across the street while waiting for the bus. He was about 30 years old, relatively short. According to her estimates, he could not have been more than 160 centimeters tall. He was, however, well-built and, at first glance, drunk. He had a bag in his hand, but she couldn't see what was inside. Dressed in a green jacket and sweatpants, he was conspicuous. He did not fuss, but characteristically dressed and with a bald spot on top of his head, he attracted attention. A glass bottle was sticking out of his jacket pocket. The girl thought he was a drunk like many. He's about to get on one of the buses, and they'll probably never see each other again. After a while, another boy came to the same bus stop across the street. He was about 20 years old. He was dressed in blue jeans and blue half-zip jacket. The boy walked past the 30-year-old several times and at one point took a bottle from his pocket. The balding man didn't even notice that his jacket had become about a liter lighter. The new owner of the local beer, as it turns out, hid the bottle under his jacket and quickly crossed the street to the other side. As he left the road, he stopped, took off the cap and took a few sips. At this point, the 30-year-old must have realized what had happened. He followed the younger one and a confrontation took place several meters from the bus stop. The young man was clearly trying to drive away the man he had just robbed, but he didn't think he would give up. The testifying girl said for the record that when the two were discussing, the younger one stood with his back to her and covered the older one. She didn't see exactly what happened, but when the 30-year-old walked away with a quick step, the other one was holding his stomach. After a moment, he crouched down. Then the witness with two other women who confirmed this testimony approached him and offered to help. Then they realized something terrible had happened. The man was bleeding profusely, but at the same time he refused to help. He walked towards the nearby houses, but after several meters he lost consciousness, falling on the pavement. Witnesses called an ambulance. Forensic technicians and investigators have not found the bottle that the younger one was holding. Then there would be a chance to secure fingerprints. Unfortunately, it was impossible. The perpetrator of the murder must have taken it with him. One of the next interrogated women testified that she came to the bus stop with this 30-year-old man. Earlier, she had passed him at the local store where he had bought a bottle of beer and a piece of sausage. Investigators decided to question the store's staff. The task was easy because only 2 shop assistants worked on a shift. In addition, they perfectly remembered the conquered client in a nylon jacket. The man in the shop was calm. He joked that he drank a little with friends, but the alcohol was over. He bought a bottle of cheap beer and a snack. One of the saleswomen noticed that the man was wearing a belt with a holster under his jacket. Inside it was a knife resembling a bayonet she described. She asked why he needed such a knife, to which the man replied that he carried it for self-defense. "You never know who you're going to meet, and I'm so small, everyone will beat me," said the 30-year-old to the saleswoman. He didn't draw any dialect. He inspired trust and certainly wasn't the type that they would be afraid of if they met him on the street. He looked more like a drunk from the shop. Perhaps in Madrid he was just passing through because they had never seen him before. In turn, witnesses from the bus stop believed that they recognized this face, but do not know where they had met this man before. It has even been suggested that he may live somewhere in the area. However, extensive operational activities and questions from residents, findings made among the homeless and local tasters of cheap alcohol did not bring anything to the matter. No one could recognize the man from the memory portrait. They managed to find out who the victim was, and 499 card was found among his personal belongings. It turned out to be Terry Brown from the UK. Terry's body was secured by the prosecutor for autopsy. It was supposed to answer the question of what was the cause of death. Every hypothesis was considered, and there was no room for guesswork in murder case. After all, it often happened that the perpetrator wounded the victim, but the wound was not fatal. Death was due to, for example, a heart attack, so there was no question of homicide. This case, however, did not bring any unexpected stories. Terry was most likely stabbed with a 7-inch knife. The injuries, including liver damage, resulted in extensive internal bleeding, which was the cause of death. Terry was 25 years old. He had come to Spain a few months earlier. He came from a small village in the UK. He had no permanent employment. When his first and only child was born, he decided to go to Spain. He found a job offer on one of the private construction sites. The Spanish contractor was paying good rates, and there were already a few UK workers working there who praised the terms of employment. Terry also wanted to find a better life there. He rented a room not far from where his life ended. The police determined that the man was not a saint. He had a history of numerous theft accusations, most of them misdemeanors, but there were also felonies. In addition, he was in court for hooligan pranks. On Friday, September 6th, he left home around 5 p.m. He told his roommates that he was going to meet a friend near the store. He'll have a few beers and come home tonight. Half an hour later, a liquor store clerk sold him a bottle of beer. He was a regular visitor to this place. Despite the fact that he lived there for a relatively short time, he became known as a cool guy and an amateur of cheap beers. The police conducted an advanced investigation. The search for the perpetrator was extended to the whole country, but no one could identify him. On March 20th, 1993, the prosecutor decided to discontinue the investigation due to the failure to detect the perpetrator. From time to time, the officers from the X-Files returned to discontinued investigations, but in this case they must count on the appearance of a witness. There is no evidence to identify the perpetrator. There are no fingerprints or genetic traces in the case file. There is only a memory portrait of the perpetrator. The truth is, if the victim hadn't stolen, the perpetrator wouldn't have reached for the knife. So is the victim to blame? Is beer theft an excuse for crime? There's no such thing as self-defense. Nobody was in danger. A coincidence and an offense committed, and as a result, murder. So ended the story of a 25-year-old man. How will the story of the wanted murderer end? If he is still alive, he may be as old as 90 today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Stay tuned and safe.